The Monsters That Made Us is brought to you by the Cage Club Podcast Network. For all things movies, music, media, monsters, and more, head on over to cageclub.me. That's cageclub.me. Today we're traveling to 1890s Paris. The Paris Opera House is eager to kick off its new season with a spellbinding production of Faust. But strange things are afoot. Whispers of an opera ghost echo through the halls. If you don't believe us, maybe you should talk to the occupant in box number 5. It's time to dress to the nines and put on your mask because we're headed deep down into the bowels of the Paris Opera House in search of the mysterious Phantom of the Opera.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
Listen to them, children of the night.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
You're crazy to know who I am, aren't you? I'll show you who I am and what I am.
You're insane. I tell you, I killed a wolf, a plain, ordinary wolf.
By studying these and other species, we add to our knowledge of how life evolved, how it adapted itself to this world.
He went for a little walk. He should have seen his face.
Welcome to the first episode of The Monsters That Made Us, the podcast where we celebrate the spooktacular characters and films in the classic Universal Studios monster series. Today we'll be talking about The Phantom of the Opera, the original silent film from 1925, starring the man of a thousand faces, Lon Chaney. I'm the invisible Dan Colón, and joining me is my illustrious co-host, Monster Mike Manzi. How you doing, Mike?
Bonjour, Daniel. Je suis Monster Mike, and I am ready to go to the opera. I got my mask, and I'm ready for a show.
Make sure you got your cape on, too, because you gotta look pretty good.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I really want to get into the history of this movie, because, frankly, the production was such a disaster. It's amazing it not only got made, but also became one of the greatest movies to come out of the silent era. Real quick, before we do that, I kind of want to get a sense of your history with the Phantom of the Opera and your thoughts after watching it this time. Had you seen this production before?
Yeah, so I had only seen this about once or twice before, and I'm not even exactly sure which version I watched, to be honest with you. It was quite a while ago, but my first introduction to the Phantom at large, he never ran into Abbott and Costello as far as I can remember, and I mostly knew him growing up from the Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber musical on Broadway.
Ah,
right?
yeah.
The spirit of the night, like all that stuff, right? My parents loved that. My dad had that soundtrack in his car for like 30 years, and I always loved it. Then later as like teenager, late teens, early college, I got really into Phantom of the Paradise by Brian De Palma, which is sort of like a rock opera version. It's more like Faust than Phantom, I guess, but it's all sort of the same stuff, just very updated into like a rock opera. And then I ended up seeing this. I probably saw this first on like Turner Classics, right? Like TCM is an amazing network. I think even Ted Turner in general is responsible for saving a lot of, maybe not these movies in particular, but like for sure trying to get these movies back in circulation, like old classic films. So I probably saw it there first. If I'm not mistaken, it's in public domain, so like you could kind of pick this up anywhere, but I got that really nice, Kino Classics copy that I think we both have on Blu-ray, and I watched every version of that for this recording, and so like that was like 3 different versions of getting ready for this. So by this point I've seen it a lot.
Yeah, same. I watched this, I want to say, somewhere around high school, college. We may have had to watch it in a film study class I had in high school. If it wasn't this, it was the Universal production of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which also starred Lon Chaney. So yeah, this has floated around in my life here and there. I can't pinpoint exactly when I first saw it, but it's impossible to not be familiar with the Phantom of the Opera in some regard. The image of Lon Chaney as his mask is being pulled off is pretty famous. That shows up whether you're seeking it out or not. That thing's just going to pop up if you're into horror or filmmaking in general. Plus, of course, the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical I was familiar with. As a kid, I read the Goosebumps version, The Phantom of the Auditorium. I haven't seen the De Palma film yet. yet, but it has quite a reputation, and I really want to seek it out at some point. Yeah, primarily my familiarity with Phantom of the Opera is this 1925 film. There are other adaptations we've mentioned, but this is the one that to me is Phantom. So I was really excited to revisit it. I didn't know until I started watching this disc. Yeah, you're right. We do have the same Kino Classics Blu-ray, and it has, I think, 3 different versions on it, but there are, like, I think 5 versions when you consider the multiple scores. There's a couple different score options you can set. There's footage from a 1930 sound release. So, I mean,
right.
It's pretty loaded with extras, and I think if you're a fan of Phantom of the Opera, I definitely would recommend that you check out this disc, because there's a lot of really good stuff to check out on it. Okay, so let's get into some of the background of it. This movie, it's a miracle it exists.
It really is a miracle that this movie exists, considering the amount of films that have been lost to time, right? And especially around this era. I know there's like an amazing audio commentary to go along with a version of this movie. Did you listen to that?
I did, yeah. And he mentioned something to the effect of the 1,000, I think there were 10,000 some silent films made in the United States in total, like only about 2,000 and change still exist. The rate of preservation is only around 20%, which is just staggering to me.
Yeah, and this was back in the day when this is silver nitrate film.
Yeah.
So this stuff is combustible. Like a couple of months ago, we had that giant explosion at the docks.
Yeah.
Remember that made the news, and that was all nitrate. And so another reason that these movies don't exist is that the prints just blew up, like quite literally. Like they would catch on fire, they would disintegrate. There's just no great way to preserve this stuff. And so this movie in particular, you could tell probably how popular it must have been at the time for copies to sort of still exist. That's sort of how I gauge the movies that have sort of been saved. Is like the rate of what their popularity must have been for a copy to last this long.
Right, and I didn't realize that, like, of course I know that film preservation became a thing much later, and now we have archivists. I have a friend who's trained in film preservation, and, you know, she gets really into that. But at the time, you know, I don't think anybody really thought that these films were going to be worth saving, maybe, or just didn't anticipate the rate of decomposition. So yeah, the amount of films that are lost to time, it makes me really sad when I think about it, because there's so many things that we'll never get to see in all likelihood. And if they still exist, the nitrate film, if it hasn't been preserved, is probably in unusable condition at this point.
Yeah, I like to think about the stuff that did survive, to go on YouTube and think we could, like, just recently someone posted like a Lumiere Brothers snowball fight outside the studio, like colorized and then speed to match, you know, modern viewing and everything, and it's remarkable and all that. And we got to remember, this is like 1925. Like, movies have not been around very long, and like feature-length films at that have not been around very long, and we're still in the silent era. So everything is very new, and you're absolutely right. I don't think people were thinking about the future. They were just living in the moment, basically. Like, film preservation, yeah, I don't think that was a term.
For sure. And I also heard that Universal Studios, of the major studios at the time, were the worst at preserving their films. So I guess we can just thank the movie gods that we still have Phantom of the Opera to look back on, because it really is an incredible film, and despite the production nightmares. Speaking of which, let's kind of get into that.
Yeah.
In 1922, Carl Laemmle, the president of Universal, went to Paris, and he had such a great time, and he was so taken with the Paris Opera House that when he met Gaston Leroux, who wrote the novel The Phantom of the Opera, Leroux gave him a copy of the novel, and he read it in a night, as the story goes, and immediately bought the film rights, specifically as a vehicle for Lon Chaney, who at the time was kind of hot shit as a silent film actor. You know, at that point he had done Hunchback, and he had done a lot of other films where he had also shown off his incredible skill with makeup.
Yeah, he was already, I think, the man of 1,000 faces,
yes.
Right? Well, I think of like the show Face Off right now, where it's like all these makeup artist experts and shit, and it's like, no, he was the only dude pretty much back then.
Yeah, he's a guy who worked double duty. I don't think it was very common. I would love to know more about that myself. But yeah, the fact that he was his own makeup artist and was able to achieve such incredible results with his skill as a makeup artist. I watched it and I thought, these effects would hold up today. If you were to put these effects into a film today, it would absolutely hold up. And I think that's a testament to his skill as a makeup artist. To me, this is the coolest part of this movie, is just seeing Lon Chaney develop this character basically on his own, because as we'll talk about, the director of this film was kind of mediocre at best and didn't have much of an eye for this stuff. So thankfully we had Lon Chaney in there to do the heavy lifting with the look of this character.
And it is a lot of heavy lifting because most of this character is going to be the look. So, like, I was surprised about that upon rewatching. There isn't a lot going on deep down otherwise that we get to really know. We really have to infer a lot by the end about who this Eric character is and all that. But I'm sure we'll get there in due time.
So Carl Laemmle gets the rights to Phantom of the Opera. He consulted a French art director, his name Ben Carré, who gave him kind of an idea of what the cellars and the underground of the opera house looked like. What I thought was fascinating about this is that his contribution to the film, he was A, not credited for, and B, didn't even find out that his work was, or his designs had been used for the film until he saw the film in the 1970s. So one of the great things about this movie is the art design, and it's amazing to me that this guy could not get any credit for it.
Yeah, man, those were the days, you know what I'm saying? Those are the days. Like, you know, Laemmle and company and everybody, like, even they had to, like, escape Edison, right? And his tyrannical grip, like, you know, it's like, oh, you're all the way on the other side of the ocean in France, like, you know, good luck to you, Red. You know, it's the 1920s. What are you gonna do? Kind of attitude is just like this philanthropy, like run wild at the time kind of stuff. But yeah, I don't know if that's the actual case, but that's how it kind of was fantasized in my mind.
Sure.
But like this look though, just real quickly, like all of this like art design and direction and all this kind of stuff, like you could tell like this is Euro, right? Like this is
100%
German expression. Like Robert Wien, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was not much sooner than this movie came out. It's amazing how quickly that visual influence sort of gripped horror gothic style so early. That's what I was sort of amazed about, is like this movie's sort of mise en scene and everything, like it's all there when you think about horror movies.
So as I was rewatching this film, you know, I was blown away. I mean, I don't know how many notes I made. I made several notes, probably I duplicated notes over the multiple times I watched this movie, just about the art design, and the opera house itself is enormous. That curtain is, I don't know how many stories tall, but they really do a great job of getting that sense of scale of the opera house. And then the sub-level areas,
the dungeons and the torture chambers.
Yeah, it all looks really good, and I think that's definitely a testament to Ben Carré's designs, but also the cinematography there, because I think that they did a great job of giving us, you know, the background, middle ground, foreground, to really give us a sense of how deep and cavernous this space was. A lot of high contrast imagery, which I thought was incredible. You know, it definitely adds to that spooky atmosphere. Lots of blacks, and then of course you've got the color tints to add to the overall spookiness of these environments. Yeah, I couldn't get over just how big the space looked, even though I'm sure a lot of this was shot on sets. The designs really sold this idea to me that this space was a lot bigger than it actually was, and that there were just catacombs upon catacombs upon catacombs. I think the Phantom says at one point they're like 5 stories below ground or something like that, and I believe it.
Yeah.
You know, there's just so many levels and layers to it.
The scope to this film is incredible. Like, I almost feel like we're here like at the end almost of the silent era, and this is like peak silent filmmaking as far as technology. You know, when you think about it, like these are all sets, these are all on sound stages. Like it boggles my mind the scope of all of this and like the perspective that they're able to pull off, you know, like as we go deeper and stuff, as you mentioned about like the sub basements, like one is where they store like all these gigantic props for the theater, and then there's another section where the Phantom can fit a goddamn horse.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Like he puts Christine on a horse and they go walking through, so you're like, damn, this place is huge. And then there's like the river, right? Like the river of runoff of like shit and everything like that. But it's enormous, you know, like all these little details, like we got to take a horse, then a boat, then we're gonna walk some more, and now we're finally at my little lair and everything. It's like, it's super impressive.
The director was Rupert Julian. He's the one who got the credit for directing this. The screenwriter was Elliot J. Clausen. Now, these are two guys who are one of several people who were credited for their jobs respectively. Rupert Julian got the top bill for the director credit, but as I've learned, this movie went through multiple reshoots, multiple rewrites. So Elliot J. Clausen, he wrote, I think, at least 3 drafts of this script. The first draft was very similar. Like he stayed pretty close to the source material. That included a scene that they did shoot in which the Phantom summons Christine to her father's grave and then plays music on a violin. There's imagery out there, like promotional imagery, of the Phantom playing the violin. They shot the scene. It got cut out. There was another scene, I think in a subsequent rewrite, where they sort of included a flashback of Eric before he became the Phantom, where he was working as a executioner in Persia.
Okay.
he fell out of favor with the Sultan and was condemned to be eaten alive by ants. You know, like, this movie could have gone in so many crazy places. So yeah, they had to keep rewriting it and rewriting it. Eventually, they decided not to have a redeeming moment for the Phantom. I know that was a thing for a little while. They wanted to give him a moment at the end where Christine kisses him or shows sympathy for him, and then I think they made the wise decision to keep him completely evil the whole time. So, like, over all these different drafts, it could have been all these different things, and I can't imagine the movie being half as good with some of this stuff staying in it. So I'm really glad that it didn't make it into the final film.
It's incredible. Like, I wasn't even aware that this movie was sort of like, this movie got kind of like a Snyder cut like treatment to it in a way. When sound pictures started coming out, Carl Laemmle pulled a Howard Hughes. Like, he's like, we're not going to reshoot the whole picture, but we're going to re-release the picture for the sound era, and we're actually going to put the opera into the Phantom of the Opera this time, right?
Exactly.
Like, we're going to reshoot some new footage. We're going to switch around some characters. You know, we're going to jigger the plot a little bit. We're going to cut maybe like a half hour out of this sucker and re-release it. And I don't think at the time anyone was none the wiser, right? Like, who could have known this was really going on? But it's just amazing that this feels like such a modern trend, and it's been there from the beginning.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I didn't realize the version of Phantom that I was most familiar with was a recut, you know, like a reissue that was entirely different from what had premiered in 1925. One of the things I learned, they really re-released this movie for sound, and then there's a whole audio track, you know? Like, I didn't know that there was audio for Phantom of the Opera.
I listened to a little of that audio track, and when the cat comes down the stairs, it's a human saying meow. It's one of the most adorable things.
Yeah, if you were to get this disc, that's definitely worth checking out. I mean, it's not the complete film. They don't have a cut of the film that syncs up to the audio that exists. So what they've done is sync up scenes that they can sync up with, and then they'll have segments without video just so you can hear the audio. But yeah, there's some really great stuff in there, like the cat's pretty funny. I wasn't aware that there were so many versions of this film in existence. So it took about 2 months to finish this film. No doubt a lot of money, a lot of rewrites. When it was tested for an audience, like, they hated it. It was deemed too intense. They really didn't respond well to it. So Carl Laemmle decided, okay, we're going back to the well. The audience cited like that they had wanted a little levity just to cut some of the intensity of the film. So instead of just throwing in some small, like, sort of light moments, they kind of went the opposite way and just went full tilt comedy, adding like all these other sort of goofy sequences. I don't have specific examples in front of me.
Oh, well, there's like the one where the stagehand is going up and down the trap door, and he's clearly doing like a Buster Keaton thing, and I was like, oh, I see, okay.
Yes. And so when they tested it again, the audience rejected it again because it was too funny. Tonally, it just wasn't jiving. So then they went to the well again a third time, and now, so what exists in this 1925 and 1929 release, a lot of it is the director Rupert Julian, his contribution to the film. I know a lot of his work was taken out for that second version of it, that more funny version, and then it was all put back in. And now we've got these character moments, like these character actors that exist, like you said, like Buster Keaton. The actor you're referring to, is it Florian Papillon? I think it is. He's one of the stagehands. He actually worked with Buster Keaton for a while in the early days. Yeah, so he came from a background of silent comedy. And I think that the film benefits from his presence, especially in that early half hour, because that's the time in the film where we're setting up this character of the Phantom, right? He's like a ghost, and everyone's telling different stories about him, and having him in there to sort of lighten the tone a little bit is a really great way to keep us like a little off guard.
Yeah, I think they do a really good job of setting the scene, you know, so to speak, like as far as telling us like, okay, this is going to take place not just like at the opera, but it's backstage, you know? It's just like almost like a movie about the process. Well, we could tell what it's like to put on a show. So everybody from like vaudeville to the opera to, you know, was probably familiar with a lot of the stuff they were seeing backstage and everything, so that probably engrossed them a little more. And I always like seeing movies like that as well, you know. It kind of, I almost thought of Birdman once or twice about like all of the just chaos that can haunt a set or a production. Certainly some of my favorite stuff is probably like the comedy, if that But like, yeah, backstage with the ballerinas and the stagehands, like it might be perceived more as like dark humor these days, because when they're talking to the man Joseph about the Phantom, they're like, Joseph knows him, and Joseph is sitting on a gigantic skull holding like a fake human head, and it's like super morose. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a double entendre jokes going on about like people are gonna be losing their heads, or like, you know what I'm saying? Like it's dark, but it's funny at the same time. I wonder if audiences could discern stuff like that, or if we're just more sophisticated.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know more about that. I really liked that contrast between those two characters, right? Because, you know, you have one guy who's maybe not taking it so seriously than the other guy who's deathly serious. Yeah, I like the balance in that early part of the film for sure.
There's also the funny stuff too, man, where like, so like as it starts out, you know, the owners of the opera house like are freaking out because of the Phantom, so they try and do like a quick shady deal and dish off the opera house to these new owners, and like after they sign the deal, the owners are like, oh yeah, by the way, like watch out for the Phantom and shit. And I was like, well, that's really funny. Like that again felt like more modern than I was expecting.
Yeah, and what kind of shady business practice is that? My first thought was, you know, it's like, you know, if you were to buy a house where somebody had committed suicide, or if there was a murder, you know, you kind of have to know that information before before you buy the house. These guys kept that information to themselves and then unloaded their opera house on a couple of unwitting suspects. And then these guys are just, now they got to deal with it. That's kind of messed up.
They're like, yeah, right. They're like, yeah, whatever, true. Like, I don't believe you. And then the next minute they open up box 5 and the Phantom's sitting there. They're like, holy shit. Like, oh no, like what? We just, damn it. Like,
that was funny. So I want to talk a little bit about the sound reissue. I thought that was pretty interesting. That the reason that Universal had reissued this movie with a new soundtrack was to respond to the rising popularity in sound films. You know, the Jazz Singer had come out just a few years prior, and now they had this movie that was popular in 1925 when it came out. It was the perfect sort of movie to add music to, because it's literally about an opera.
I wanted to ask you real quick. Try and put yourself in the shoes of, even today, right? Like, you go into a movie called Phantom of the Opera and there's no opera in it. Like, would you be pissed as a person back in the day, or would you kind of like understand that the technology at the time doesn't allow? Like, would you know as like a layman what's going on, or would you feel sort of burned about that? And I think that might have led to why this was re-released. Like, I think that's why so much extra effort was put into its re-release. Was like, it's like a eureka, like we could put the actual music into this movie that fits, kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's hard to know how people would have responded to that in 25, because they weren't used to hearing sound with films, right? So if you went to see a movie and it was about an opera, you would definitely see the opera, and I think the movie succeeds in that. But I don't know that they would have been expecting to hear people sing. But yeah, how perfect is this film for a re-release now that we have sound? What I love is that they decided they were going to re-release it, but not only that, they were going to shoot brand new footage to increase the amount of opera footage in the film and present more, or create more possibilities for sound. I also learned that the original woman who played Carlotta in the 1925 version was replaced for the 1930 reissue. And so what they did was, in the 1930 reissue, they created these scenes where she's in the manager's office, you know, screaming at the managers because she wants to be on stage, singing Marguerite in the show. And so what they did was they just kind of creatively made her Carlotta's mother, created new text cards, and they have the whole letter from the Phantom, and then suddenly she's Carlotta's mother. Then they recast Carlotta with a different actor for the opera scenes.
It's incredible, man. Like, that made me think of Singing in the Rain. You know, that movie is about when sound film comes out. One of the most popular silent film actresses has just like the worst voice for sound pictures, and so they do like the whole Milli Vanilli thing, where like they get this woman to fill in for her voice, but then she becomes great, so I think they end up just replacing her altogether. It's been a while since I saw the movie, but you know, this poor woman, you know, Virginia Pearson, who plays Carlotta, like not only in the show, like in the story, does Carlotta get like the boot and everything and shoved out the side, but like this actress playing her gets recast and like has to play her own mother. It's so crazy. Like, I love it.
Yeah, I don't know that it was because they couldn't get Virginia Pearson to reprise the role. Like, I don't know the story behind that. It's possible that 4 years later, when they were recutting, she was onto something else. And then they had this footage they had to use, so I could very easily see them saying, all right, well, this is the footage we got, we can't get rid of it, so, you know, we can re-edit it so that she becomes an entirely new character, and then just recast Mary Fabian as the new Carlotta.
So smart, man.
how do you make a movie like that? It's insane.
Just like a title card here, like a title card there, and the context is completely different. It's amazing. To think in that dimension, we went to school and studied film, but we studied talkies,
Sure.
I watch a lot of silent film, but like when you watch like Chaplin, and they're making these silent films, you see like the director just yelling shit at him, like just, because they can't hear it. So he's just like, now you're angry, now you're mad, now you're even more mad. It's hard to think like that in modern times.
Oh, 100%. I guess the closest that we've gotten to a situation like this was when Terry Gilliam was like midway through production of The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus and Heath Ledger died. And so he had to find a way to finish the movie without his lead actor because so much of the movie was fantastical, presented an opportunity for that character to be recast. And so we've got, who was it? It was Colin Farrell, Jude Law, and Johnny Depp, I think, all playing that character at various points in the film. That's the only sort of modern example I can think of where a film was being made and then like they had to pivot and just totally recast the role in a way that made sense. I can't think of a different example, but I think that's amazing that a film can be made that way.
And it's crazy because nowadays it's kind of frowned upon, like I mentioned earlier, the Snyder cut, right? And like, I'm excited for it, but like, it's got a bad reputation already. And like things like the Star Wars special editions, those came to mind, okay? Or like just all the times people went back and tinkered with shit to change it, it just felt kind of like on the wrong side. But to see it here this early is really making me like reconsider my opinion about a lot of that and like kind of going back and giving it like a more of a benefit of the doubt, I guess.
I don't know that anybody is yammering for a Rupert Julian cut of this movie because, as I said before, he was a pretty mediocre director.
No, I have a feeling that, Carl Laemmle was sort of running the whole show most of the time anyway, in a very sort of Howard Hughesian, not in the same type of person, but in that kind of persona, like lauded over the entire studio system. Almost think of like Hail Caesar, where he was probably just like walking around the lot all day long, going from one production to another, like giving his notes, making sure they're doing what he says.
There's stories that I've heard about Rupert Julian had these ideas that he wanted to do for the film, and the most popular example of that is the chandelier falling onto the audience. He wanted the film to cut to black at that point, and nobody else agreed with him. The cinematographer didn't agree with him because he thought, why would you cut to black? The chandelier in the opera house is not the only source of light. So he just kind of like yesed Rupert Julian in the moment and then shot it the way he wanted to. And that's why the movie doesn't cut to black when that thing falls down. So even Lon Chaney had a pretty contemptuous relationship with Rupert Julian to the point where they wouldn't even speak to one another. And Rupert Julian would tell the cinematographer, tell Lon to do this. And then Lon Chaney famously responded, tell him to go to hell.
It sounds like John Landis and Eddie Murphy on the set of Coming to America, where like, how do you make an amazing movie where you're not even talking to each other? But Lon Chaney also strikes me as the kind of guy you don't tell him how to do his job, right? It's like, we got Lon Chaney, man, like back up, let him do his thing and like just take the credit, right? Like that's all you need to do. Don't go tinkering with too much, and if you do, know when to sort of say when.
It's possible that's the case, but based on what I've learned about Lon Chaney, he was really not a diva and was not really into being a movie star. Now, he may have thought he knew better than his director with this film, so it's certainly possible. Just saying that the impression I've gotten of Lon Chaney as a human being was not that he was like super into being a movie star and just kind of having that diva attitude.
Yeah, I only know what I know from the James Cagney movie, The Man of a Thousand Faces, but I did find out that his parents were deaf. I thought that was kind of interesting, and the movie makes that like extremely taboo for the time, which I don't know was absolutely accurate, but like that was interesting to find out that his parents were deaf, and I don't know if that sort of colored the way that he made his face look, right? Like because of like if you could tell everything you need to say in an expression, what's the use of words, right? And it's kind of amazing he became like this huge silent film star at that.
Right. Yeah, that would certainly make sense considering, I mean, just the work in this film. His facial expressions are great, and he doesn't have, I mean, in the second half of the film he has plenty of opportunities to really be expressive with his face, but for the first half he's doing it all with his hands. I didn't realize just how expressive he was with just his hands until I watched this 3, 4, 5 times in the past couple weeks. I was like, man, he's really doing a lot of work, because in a lot of those silhouettes, that's still Lon Chaney.
Yeah, his body language is incredible, right? Like I look forward to seeing how him and Dracula compare when it comes to their hypnotic hand gestures and everything.
Yeah, they're very similar, right? One quick thing I forgot about with the sound re-release that I didn't know is that, so Universal and Lon Chaney, like the contract they had with him, did not allow for them to dub footage of Lon Chaney when you could see him.
Oh, is that why there was no scream? I was so expecting them to overdub like a scream of Christine when she reveals the Phantom's face, but he's in the shot, so I guess they couldn't.
Yeah, there was some kind of contract stipulation that if he was on screen, they could not dub his voice. I don't know the specifics of that arrangement, but that's why, whenever he's on screen, you never hear him speak.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever heard his voice. When we get to Karloff, like he went on and to become sort of like a very distinct voice with his distinct lisp and everything, right, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, Bella, very, distinct voice, Claude Rains, like down the line pretty much. So I don't think I've ever heard this guy's voice, which is interesting.
Yeah, and like we hear the Phantom speak a couple times, but it's always in silhouette. So I don't know if you noticed that.
Oh, those are some great title cards too, where like you get the text and his silhouette at the same time.
Yeah. I made a note about that one. The best one that I saw was when the chandelier is about to collapse and he says, "Behold, she is singing to bring down the chandelier." Like that was one of the greatest because you don't typically see the text on top of the image like that. So yeah, good call. I really enjoyed that moment.
And so much like iconic about the Phantom, like we're going on, like it's his look, it's his movement, like you can tell from the silhouette, right? Like that is almost like the mark of a good character design, and he's just a hat and a cape at that point, yet it's still distinct. Like it's very impressive. That's my word of the night, I think. This movie that's almost 100 years old, I'm having like a Matrix moment, right? Where it's like blowing my mind on all these different levels and shit. And that's how I wonder if people felt watching this. Was it just too much? Were people's minds getting blown left and right? I mean, we haven't even talked about the fact that there was color in a movie from 1925.
Yes.
Like what?
I don't think the color version was in the 25 film. Maybe it was. That I'm a little fuzzy on.
It's in the 1929 20 frame per second version that I watched. So that much I know. So I'm not sure if that was shot in 25 or what, but I believe the guy on the commentary said it's 2-color Technicolor. They don't have all of the actual footage, so the masquerade sort of shifts back to black and white towards the end.
Right, and not only was it 2-color Technicolor for that scene, but then there are other moments in the film, specifically the scene after that where Christine and Raoul are on the roof and the Phantom is above them. His cape is blowing in the wind. That was all done by hand.
That reminds me of Spawn, the comic book character, because it's just so gothic and he's got the giant flowing red cape and everything. But what an impact that, like, okay, we only have like a certain amount of time to use color because it was probably super expensive and very hard to do this, and so to use it for the masquerade ball sequence is just perfect. It's perfect because like he's in this shocking red costume. Later on they bring the color back for the fire for red, so like red is really the primary one for the most part. It really sticks out. And it's really cool, too, how they also use tints for the rest of the film, which was a common practice at the time, but just felt like it belonged much more with sequences of color in addition.
Yeah, and I think that masquerade ball sequence, it still is very inspiring and very impressive. I watched it, and I love when I see these old films that have been given color. Before color film was really a common practice.
There's another Ted Turner thing was he colorized all that shit at one point.
Yes, he did.
A lot of people were pissed.
So to get a little bit off track, I got to see a copy of Georges Méliès's A Trip to the Moon that had been colorized. It was a rare color print, and like every cell had been hand painted, which was incredible to see projected. So that's when I first learned about early color film, how they would do it, and they would paint these cells by hand. I thought, how the hell do you make a whole movie? I mean, that was just was that a 20-minute film? So I love the way that they put color to use in this, because I don't know that I would love the film as much if it was completely in color. I think that the tints and the deep contrast really do a great job of selling the spookiness of this story. But that's the party scene, right? And then now we've got all this color, and I have to wonder how how audiences responded to that in 1929. You know, like we think about The Wizard of Oz being this moment where, you know, we're in sepia tone and we open the door and now we're in Oz and it's like bright colors. Like this must have had some similar effect in 29.
Oh, yeah, that's a good call. That totally compares. Like that's 10 years later, right? That's in 39. And I mean, you know, Gone with the Wind is a full color movie the same year, but the idea that Wizard of Oz used going from sepia tone to color is very much reminds me now of this, because once the color's here, it's here for the rest of the movie in waves, right? Like they bring it back and touch it. It's like once they introduce like an element or a gimmick, they keep it. You know, they kind of keep it around, right? Yeah. It's not going to be all color, but later, like I said, we get the flames, we get the Phantom's weird little like assistant's face in color when he's coming towards the screen and stuff. Like it's here and there.
Yeah, I always love that stuff, and I was really happy with how that looks. I mean, this Kino disc, I don't want to keep plugging it, but they did such a great job with the restoration, and I think it's definitely one of the show-stopping moments of this film. So credit to them.
I watched the 1925 version, and it's not as polished as the 1929 version, right? Like they didn't really put it through the same process, I guess, or maybe it's just the print that they had compiled, or I don't know, whatever factors involved. But I found that kind of interesting, where they're like, no, maybe you should, like, this is the one we want you to watch, and the rest is sort of just for like historical homework or whatever like that.
We've kind of given a rough overview of the production of this film, and we've kind of gotten into some specific sequences. We can kind of get into just the film itself and what we enjoyed about it, what we maybe didn't, or whatever the case may be. But, you know, for most people, I think we're all familiar with the Phantom of the Opera. The Paris Opera House is opening for a new show. It's been sold at the last second to a new set of owners, and there is a Phantom lurking behind the scenes. So with this new production of Faust, we find that there are a lot of things going on, sort of like mysterious things backstage. And of course we learn the Phantom is taken with Christine, who is the understudy for Carlotta, who has the famous Marguerite scene in Faust, and he is going to do whatever it takes to make sure she gets top billing in this show. And so of course he kills a couple people, and, you know, just generally makes life miserable for the people of the opera house. Let's see who else, what other characters we have. We've got Raoul, who is in love with Christine as well.
Excuse me, but it's Vicomte Raoul de Chagny. This guy's my man. I mean, he goes from being a cuck to being the hero, right? Like, he's not going to be sidelined by no Phantom. No one's going to steal his girl. This dude fascinates me for whatever reasons. Like, I can't put my finger on it all. But I was like, why is he so fancy? Like, what's his deal? What's a Viscount? Like, what is all that shit? And, like, he's just, like, a wealthy landowner dude. Like, he's just kind of like a rich guy. Like, he might have been in the military just by looking at him. I don't know, man. I thought this guy was cool because, like, he goes to Christine and he's like, we got to get married. And Christine's like, I can't. I'm in love with this Phantom. I've never even, well, she doesn't say the Phantom, but she's like, I can't leave the opera. Like, in fact, I can never see you again. And he overhears the Phantom sort of like wooing her and hypnotizing her and shit. And he's like, I ain't going to stand for that, man. Like, I'm not going to be second fiddle to no Phantom, bro. I just love how he fought for her. I just thought it was like that old fashioned chivalry kind of stuff, almost swashbuckler or something like that. This dude impressed me.
In this particular version of Phantom of the Opera, I find Raoul and Christine to be maybe the least interesting characters. Yeah, I think we watch different movies. There are other productions of this story where Raoul has a bigger role. He's given more to do. I think in the Joel Schumacher movie, there's like a whole sword fight between him and the Phantom.
Oh, dope.
Yeah, so Raoul in other versions of the story is given a lot more to do, but in this version I find that both of them are a little bit flat for the story, but I don't mind it because I'm so captivated with the Phantom character. They're kind of stock lover characters in this. This version really puts the Phantom front and center and really spends a lot of time building, you know, the mood. And even in, like I said, the first 30 minutes of this film, Lon Chaney, you never see him, but he is in every frame of this film, just, you know, in the periphery, right? Like, he's always there. We always know he's somewhere.
He's in shadow. He's like hidden here and there. He's always dropping notes, right? Yep. He's like, do this or else, like, do this or else. I'm like, dude, the boy is just haunting them so hard.
Yeah, so I don't mind that our romantic leads are just a little bit flat because Chaney is so great as the Phantom and that the film really plays to his strengths. But another character I really like is Ledoux. He is our sort of mysterious figure in the background. Whenever there's some sort of phantom activity going on, he always seems to be there. He's there on opening night. Even some of the ballerinas kind of wonder, maybe he's the Phantom. And then at the masquerade ball, the Phantom arrives in his Red Death costume, and Ledoux is not far behind. So I like Ledoux quite a bit. The 1925 version gave more backstory to all of these characters, right? Christine and Raoul and Ledoux they get a little more screen time.
Way more. I feel like there's way more. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that cutting out a lot of Ledoux's scenes for the 1929 version is a good move. I kind of prefer Ledoux when he's more mysterious. I don't want to know as much as they tell us about him in that original cut.
Yeah, I feel like he's played to be a red herring in the newer version. Right? I guess it is the newer and the older version. But like, yeah, in the 29 version, like it's much more like maybe he is the Phantom pretty much until the masquerade, right? Where he sees, the Phantom's there and he's there and they're in the same place at the same time and everything. But I think he's really striking. I wonder, because like, I also think we find out that he's special police earlier in the 25 cut. And I wonder if that is sort of like a holdover in any way from the novel, not necessarily this character, but from what I understand, the novel is more of like a detective novel, and I think we follow like a detective who's sort of trying to figure out what's going on at the opera house, and so maybe that's sort of a nod. This character might be like kind of that, because we don't have too many cops in this movie. I noticed there's one or two. I think they might even be excised from the 29 version, but like they actually go to a police station in the 1925 version and like introduce each other to each other and being like, yes, I'm here from out of town and like I'm looking for the Phantom and I'm gonna be around and like, all that kind of stuff. So I like that they kept him this mysterious weirdo.
Yeah, same. So the Phantom is giving the owners of the theater multiple warnings that Carlotta is not to appear as Marguerite during Faust and that Christine will take her place. And of course that goes as well as expected. Christine gets the gig that first time, but then everyone starts to doubt the seriousness of the Phantom, which they should not do. Carlotta insists on going out there to perform, and so the Phantom drops the chandelier on top of the audience, which most people I think know that moment from the musical.
That was the big moment I knew about from the musical for sure, was like a chandelier falls and like people get crushed and all that. What I also didn't remember, because it had been a while since I'd seen this, but the idea that they're performing Faust, like there is some kind of cool double meaning going on there with this deal with the devil kind of thing. And it kind of reminded me of Shakespeare. I didn't know that it would, but it's like in Hamlet.
Yeah.
They're doing a play within a play. Yep. And like that play is about what Hamlet's going through, and he like put it on intentionally so that his uncle would see, like, I know what you did and everything. It's like about some like guy who killed his brother or something. And so it was really cool in here to be like, oh yeah, like even when we're not following the Phantom and shit, like we're following Faust, and that story intersects or like interweaves into what we're kind of watching here too, like this Faustian Christine's deal with the devil per se.
And so the Phantom then sneaks into Christine's dressing room and sort of sweeps her away and takes her down into his lair deep beneath the Paris Opera House. And that's really the first time we really get to see the Phantom in his own element. And I think that whole sequence, as we mentioned before, of getting from her dressing room down into his lair is one of the more fun sequences to watch, just for those who appreciate set design and good high contrast cinematography.
Yeah, I love the horse.
And the horse.
I can't get over the Phantom's horse, man. Like, that's shocking. And also the Phantom's mask. Very unsettling. Like, maybe almost more than when you see his real face. It's very creepy, and I wonder if this was some kind of, connection to this is after World War I, right? Like, I feel like this might have been saying, like, people with deformities are trying to live lives, and I think of, like, the Elephant Man and things like that when I see the Phantom with a mask on.
Right.
I think of, like, a guy trying to conform to society, but it just won't allow him. I don't really want to give that kind of empathy to this character, per se, when I find out what he's up to and all that, but I wondered if there was something like that going on at the time.
Well, there was definitely some element of that coming from Lon Chaney. I know that he, as an actor, would play a lot of deformed characters. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of deformed characters he played, and with each and every one, he tried to bring some sense of humanity to those characters, and I do think that he succeeds to some degree in this film, even though the Phantom is pretty messed up and pretty monstrous in his expectations. But, like, I can see the sympathetic person underneath the evil, the evil intent.
Yeah, he was supposed to, like, die of a broken heart in the original or something. Like, they wanted you to empathize at some level.
Yes, and even though they got rid of that sort of sympathetic ending, I do think Lon Chaney's performance does elicit some level of sympathy for this guy who had been born deformed and, mistreated and so on and so forth. Like in other versions of this story, I've seen the Phantom be deformed in the film, like it wasn't like he was born that way. Maybe it was acid. Like in the 1943 version, which we'll get to, in that version, he gets a chemical splashed onto his face, and that's what deforms his face. I like that this version was born deformed, was not made into a monster. It was just he was born this way, and then he just unfortunately took the wrong path through life. He decided to become a kind of a creeper asshole.
It's crazy because we don't really get to know a lot about Eric, which is all we really know of his. We don't even get a last name for this guy. All we really know is that he escaped from like an insane asylum, and he knows the black arts or something. But we don't even know, like, he could have been locked up just because of how he looked, right? Like, he could have just been going about his day trying to help someone across the street, and then he's thrown in jail for 5 or 6 years or whatever, and he's forced to go insane or something, right? So that I could kind of see, like, part of it being they not made me do it, but like they kind of molded me into this monster in a way, right? Like, I didn't really want to do this, but like I can't help it at this point.
Right. I think there was some version of that in previous scripts. It doesn't really make it into the final version, but I think that's definitely in the subtext to some degree. And again, like I was saying, I think that's Lon Chaney trying to bring that out of the character with the script he had to work with. I think we both agree that this particular Phantom is just a psycho and he deserves to get thrown into a river.
Torn to shreds.
But I do believe that there's some humanity in there, and that's largely due to Lon Chaney's performance.
Yeah, it's funny because we were kind of talking a little bit last night before we were recording. And I'm like, man, the Phantom, he's like an incel. He's like Joker, right?
Yeah.
Like, he sits, not only is he in his basement, he's 5 basements down. He catfishes this poor woman, right?
Yep.
He's like, Eric, like, I'm the voice of music, I'm the spirit of sound, come with me. He hypnotizes this woman into his bedroom, and then he takes off the mask, and she immediately wants to go home. She's like, you tricked me, you jerk off, like, what are you doing? And he's like, it is true, I am your master, you must obey me. I'm like, whoa, buddy, like, this got extreme way faster and way harder than I remember. Like, this plays way more monstrous the further time marches on.
Yeah, I can see how this might have been to some degree kind of romantic in the 1920s. Like, I can see how the audience might read it that way.
Romantic, yeah, weird.
And I can see why the Andrew Lloyd Webber plays it a little more romantic. But yeah, watching this, I think I texted you and I was like, he's a fucking neckbeard. He deserves to get thrown into the Seine at the end of this movie. He pulls the whole master shit before we even see his face. He's basically like, I've gotten you the lead role in this show. I'm gonna make you a star, and in return, you have to love me and marry me, and so on and so forth.
Dude, is this A Star Is Born? Like, is this the first, like, version of that? It's like, hey, and she just turns around and he's like, I just wanted to see you one more time. Like,
I mean, there might be something to that. I don't know.
or maybe it's just one of those tales as old as time, right? Where it's just like this guy who, whether it be a man or a woman, just like crafts this person in their image, and then that person is like, I want to be my own person, and then just like the resentment collides.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who has been the victim of unrequited love, like I can certainly sympathize with some part of him.
Here.
But, I don't condone the hypnotizing and abduction of innocent women.
Yeah, I don't have, like, a secret love pad in a torture chamber.
Right, and so is, like, lair. So some of the things that I loved about that lair was just the set design. And I mean, it's not crazy elaborate or anything like that, but there's some fun details in there. Like, my man sleeps in a coffin.
He sleeps in a coffin, bro. That's dark, man. And, like, right, that's before Dracula. Was Dracula published at the time? Could that have sort of been a grab to be like, we want to do a little Dracula, like we want to throw a little more in here or something? I don't know, but I'm just wondering. It made me think of Dracula.
Yeah, there's a couple things in this film that reminded me of other things that were yet to come, so him sleeping in a coffin obviously reminded me of Dracula as well. But then at the end of the movie, you've got Joseph's brother leading a crowd of people with torches and pitchforks. And I was like, wait a second. When I think torches and pitchforks, I think Frankenstein. But like, no, we've got him here in 1925. So yeah, there's definitely some stuff in here, things we associate with other characters that, like these hallmarks like coffins and torches and pitchforks and angry mobs and all those things, are here in 1925 in Phantom of the Opera, which is, I don't mean this in the most literal sense, but I think Phantom of the Opera is one of the more romantic of the early films. You know, I don't mean it romantic in that the Phantom in his pursuit of love is romantic, but like there's a romance to this film, like the sets and the costuming, and like it's a very beautiful film. Like that's sort of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it's an opera. You know what I'm saying, man? Like it's bombastic. And I think the romance between, you know, for me anyway, I know it's a little different for you, but I think Raoul and Christine make up for it for me. You know, I think there's like that adventure action stuff that kicks in later. It becomes, you know, very Indiana Jones, where they're like, you know, going through different traps and getting caught in the different elaborate, you know, torture devices. And, you know, first they're being set on fire and then they're being drowned and like all this stuff. And it gets there for me, but I hear what you mean. Like visually, yes, that whole sort of gothic sensibility, right? I think I'm not sure how much it's been on display to this point in America, and especially at this degree. Like this is just an epic. Like it's just so wide scope.
For sure.
You know, when you look at it, it's huge. One more thing about the Phantom's little like love nest. My boy, he's got a foot fetish. Did you notice he stole Christine's shoes and had them down there for her when she woke up?
No.
That is creepy, man. Maybe I'm a creeper for picking up on that, but like, I'm like, what are you smelling those shoes with? You have no nose, man. Like,
I didn't pick up on that. Oh, man. Okay. So when Christine is down in his lair, he basically tells her that she has to do everything he says because he made her a star. Then we have the infamous reveal. The condition that he gives her, you know, you'll have everything you ever want as long as you love me and never touch my mask, right? So, of course, the first thing she does is pull his mask off. We get that incredible reveal, which I think is, again, I think I said at the beginning of the show, one of the most famous images from the silent era, like, ever.
I think one of the most famous, like, film frames in history, because, like, we're talking about early horror, you know, like, this comes so early in the genre itself. So, like, I feel like when people just single out horror movies of the era, this pops up probably immediately. But that is still a very powerful moment. You can hear her scream.
Yeah.
And it's a silent film, but like just by looking at her, you can hear it. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I read somewhere that his makeup, like the look of the Phantom, was kept a secret from everybody until the film was released. Like even in the trailers for the Phantom, that, you know, they tell you, you know, we're keeping it all completely hidden. You might catch a few glimpses of Lon Chaney in the trailer. You know, of course they're just shadows of the Phantom in the background. But yeah, the story is that Universal kept this a secret from everybody, including the other actors on the set. So as the story goes, Mary Philbin did not know what Lon Chaney was going to look like until she pulled that mask off. So what we see on screen is her natural reaction.
Wow, man. Even then they were like not improving, but doing stuff like that, like getting the natural reaction. Like you hear stories about that with Alien and Ridley Scott, right? Where like people they didn't know when the chest burster was going to come how sort of like violent it was going to be. So those are natural reactions. I heard the story about The Dark Knight. No one knew what Heath Ledger was going to look like until they filmed that scene in the kitchen with all the mob bosses. So like, you know, you look at Eric Roberts and he like kind of has this fucking look on his face like, what the hell what is that? Like, what am I looking at?
Yeah.
Like, it's very genuine stuff. And so, again, man, I can't believe they're doing this shit way back then. But that's just filmmaking, man. They've just always been doing it. I just have to adjust my way of thinking.
Yeah, so they've always been doing it, but what I find with these early films is like a sense of showmanship, almost like a William Castle kind of thing, where the studio makes a big deal about it. You know, like, we're not going to show you what he looks like until the movie, you know, kind of almost like what Hitchcock might have done in the 60s. We don't see that so much anymore. I think these stories come out later after a movie's done, like you said with The Dark Knight. You know, like, his look was not really kept secret from the audience, right? You know,
you can't in this day and age. Exactly. Back then, like, people didn't even read the newspaper back in the 20s. You know, like, how many people really even were educated enough to read is what I've started. That's why they all went to movies. I mean, that's just how I'm thinking about. Maybe the 20s isn't that unsophisticated. It's just I've seen too many movies. I don't know.
I'm trying to think of another star who would like a modern star where a studio could have that sort of strategy where, like, we know you love this guy, we know this guy is always buried under makeup and he's gonna have a unique look. Like, we just don't have that anymore. I mean, we get a little bit of that with, like, my first thought is like with Doug Jones in a Guillermo del Toro film. Like, we know he's always going to be buried under prosthetics and makeup, but like he doesn't have that star quality. Like this would be akin to like Tom Cruise being put into some crazy makeup, and like we don't get to see it until the movie releases, right? Like we just don't get that.
Well, I was even thinking I was gonna say Tom Cruise, but in regards to like his stunts, right? And it's like, come to see the new Mission Impossible because he's gonna try to kill himself, right? Like,
Sure.
that's kind of their marketing at this point, and it's incredible. I mean, the guy nowadays that I go to, and there's really only one, and it's like Andy Serkis, right?
Sure.
And it's a whole different ball game when it comes to this dude now, because like he's clearly a student of Lon Chaney, but like, his makeup's digital and shit. And so like he's even breaking new ground. It's weird, like he also doesn't get like nearly the respect he kind of deserved, the attention. I feel like he gets a lot, don't get me wrong, but I feel like he should be a mega name as opposed to just like what he is now and stuff, and like like blank checks left and right for that guy. Like, just let him try anything, man. He's just so progressive. Like, I love that guy. So, but yeah, you're right, like one name in like 100 years.
Yeah, like I can't think of another guy who was so well known for being an actor and a makeup artist, actually, I mean, I can. Okay, I take it back. Tom Savini is probably the closest we get to this, but Tom Savini, he's not on the level that Lon Chaney was in terms of Hollywood stardom, right?
He just doesn't have the acting chops. I don't think that's his focus. I think he's more on the makeup side.
Right.
Yes, he can act, and yes, he does act, but like he's not known as the actor. He's known more, I think, as more for the makeup.
Right. Yeah. So if I were to pick a modern day analog to Lon Chaney, I'd probably go Tom Savini because he does act quite a bit. He doesn't have the star status that Lon Chaney had in the 20s.
He's recognizable. Like, he doesn't do this to himself in his movies. He's too vain, right? Like, he's always showing up looking like Tom Savini.
That's true.
I mean, he'll turn himself into a vampire or kill himself, but like he's showing up. He wants you to know it's him.
For sure.
I don't mean to like come down hard on Tom Savini. I think the guy's a legend.
Oh yeah, we're definitely fans of Tom Savini on this show. I get what you're saying. Okay, so after the reveal, the Phantom decides he's going to allow Christine to go back to the opera to sing under the condition that she only ever loves him and does not speak a word of what she's seen to anybody. And of course, the first thing that she does is find Raoul at the masquerade ball and tell him about this arrangement that she has with the Phantom.
Tells him everything, like immediately.
Yeah.
She's like, I swear, if you just let me go. And he's like, okay. And she's like, oh my God, he fucking fell for that?
Right. And so, as we've mentioned, there's the famous masquerade ball sequence where the Phantom shows up dressed in the guise of the Red Death, which is, again, one of the most impressive sequences in this film. Just from a technical standpoint, if you love old black and white silent films, this scene is like a shot in the arm visually. And the subsequent scene on the rooftop, I think, is even better in a lot of ways.
I already mentioned my love of the Spawn imagery
Yes.
in the rooftop, but in the 1925 version on the disc, when they go to the masquerade, they play that Dance Macabre.
Yes.
At the masquerade ball. I thought that was great. With all the different soundtracks and stuff like this. Also on the 25 version early on is that little Hitchcock Presents riff. It's like dun 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 dun.
Yep.
Dun, 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 dun. I was like, what's going on here? It was all very enjoyable.
Agreed. After the Phantom overhears Christine spilling the beans about everything, he arranges for the next performance. He sets everything up so that he can kidnap Christine and whisk her away to do whatever it is he wants to do. and so now all the pieces are in place. Ledoux and Raoul pursue the Phantom and Christine, and Joseph Bouquet, your favorite character, or your favorite maybe side character, his brother is going to avenge his death because Joseph. Oh yeah, we didn't really talk about Joseph, but I mean, a small character. But
well, he's hanged because he knows how to get down to the Phantom's lair. Like, he's found all the secret entrances, and the Phantom figured that out. I almost wondered if that was him in that reshot intro, if that was him sort of lurking around in the dungeon, and then the Phantom saw him. Or I'm not sure what's happening in those sequences still.
Oh, it could be. Yeah, I don't know what's going on in those opening sequences, but I think they're gorgeous. I made that note.
Yeah, but him being hanged, that reveal I was like, whoa, that's shocking.
Yeah.
That worked.
So now we've got like multiple things all colliding into the same space.
This last half hour is like action-packed. It's just nonstop.
The Phantom takes Christine down into his lair, and then everyone is sort of descending into the subterranean Parisian crypts and whatnot to capture the Phantom and rescue Christine. We've got Raoul and Ledoux teaming up, and they have found a secret trapdoor to get down there.
Yeah, they end up in the torture chamber rooms, like the room of mirrors that gets like super hot, and then the room with all the gunpowder that gets super flooded.
Right. So I wondered at the beginning of this movie when they talk about how the underground of the Parisian opera house had, torture chambers and dungeons. Like, why is that relevant? Like, A, why are they there? B, why does that matter? And so I found out that, those did exist to some degree because of the Second Revolution in France. So they do exist underground. B, they matter for this story because as Raoul and Ledoux pursue the Phantom, they end up caught in one of those rooms. Basically, they're like kind of in a furnace for a little while, right? And in exchange for their lives, Christine has told the Phantom that she will marry him. So she saves Raoul and Ledoux by promising her life and love to the Phantom, who then whisks her away.
But there's the one moment I gotta mention that just like, I wonder now that you mentioned it earlier if they put this in because they needed more comedy. So like the first two guys go together, then Raoul's brother goes at it alone, and then sort of the mob comes down after him. And the Phantom fucking takes this long bamboo shoot, puts it in his mouth, and walks underneath the river of runoff and just sewage and shit and everything. It's like fucking Bugs Bunny in a pond where you just see this little thing sticking out of the water, and like, oh, there's the Phantom, like being all sneaky and shit. And then he just pushes over the boat and drowns the dude. And then you see him walk out of the water again, and he's just covered in shit, bro. That's like all I could think about.
Yeah, I love that scene. So it's on the cover of the Blu-ray, and that image was also on the poster.
Oh my god, it is! Look at that! That's amazing.
Like, the image that was on the poster was the Phantom underwater with that sort of bamboo or the, it was like a snorkel.
Yeah.
It's a snorkel.
Like a pipe. Yeah, like a snorkel.
I have never seen a living human pull that off until this movie. You're right, because it is very Bugs Bunny or Mickey Mouse.
Or like ninja, right? Like that's ninja shit. Like how did they know about that?
Right. I do think that is meant to be some kind of levity. I mean, it certainly is by today's standards. I think it's impossible to watch that in 2020 and not kind of giggle at it. I'd have to wonder what audiences in the 1920s thought of something like that, because it's just so silly. But I do love that as a moment. It's weird, and because it's so cartoony, you don't expect him to take that route, but he does it, and he makes it work. So I do love that moment. Thank you for reminding me about that. Then the Phantom takes the carriage that Raoul has arranged to wait for he and Christine for the end of the show. His plan being that once the show's over, they will get in the carriage and they will move to England. And so the Phantom takes the carriage, and the crowd with the torches and pitchforks all chase after him, and he speeds off with Christine in the carriage, looking like a madman. I think
amazing.
Yeah, in no other part of this movie does the Phantom look better. I think that the high energy, sort of frenetic cinematography here could be clearer, but at the same time, the way it's lit and just that sort of haphazard pace of the editing and everything, it just really sells this idea that they're moving incredibly fast and he is a crazed maniac on the loose.
And then we get our one big stunt, I feel, right?
The one big stunt that is not the chandelier.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, right. I consider this more of a stunt because I guess, like, it's a car crash. Like, a person jumps out of a carriage and then the carriage crashes and the Phantom goes, like, tumbling out of it. It looks like these two stunt people look like they got crippled or something. Like, I just was not expecting that level of sensationalism, I guess, at this point. But wow, that was crazy.
Yeah, and the way they speed up the film for that sequence, it just looks so good.
Oh, dude, you probably just nailed it. Like, they filmed that at, like, 2 frames, and then they just sped it up. Like, someone just hopped out of the carriage, right? And then, like, they overcranked it or whatever.
I know that's how they filmed the chandelier. So the chandelier was lowered slowly on top of the audience, and then they undercranked the camera so that it would record, like maybe 6 frames per second, so that when they were to speed it up, it would fall dramatically faster. So yeah, I'd be surprised to find out that they didn't do something similar with the carriage, because that seems like a pretty dangerous stunt. But yeah, it's a pretty great climax, of course, and Raul tends to his bride-to-be, and the mob confronts Eric the Phantom along the Seine. And I love that moment when he, like, in a last-ditch effort, goes to pull something out of his jacket and holds it up in a clenched fists, and then they all kind of recoil, like, what has he got in his hand? And then, of course, you know, he's got nowhere to go. He reveals he's got nothing in his hand. They tear him limb from limb and throw him in the river. Like I said, it's an ending fit for a character as despicable as he is. I certainly find it difficult to feel sorry for him.
Yeah, I maybe like was starting to feel sorry for, like, not sorry for him, but I was like starting to be like, maybe this guy, and then it's like, oh no, you know what I'm saying? Like I always feel like they try to get you, but at the end they want you to remember, like, nope, like this guy should be teared limb from limb and thrown into the river by an angry mob.
I think we both watched this movie a bunch of times. The more I think about it, the more I am happy that they didn't try to make him sympathetic in the end, because so much of his behavior is so despicable that, like, by 2020 standards, this movie still holds up in terms of how it resolves, right? Like, we're not trying to make excuses. We're not trying to humanize this predator.
That's exactly what he is, you know, and they probably didn't have a word for it back then. Like all they knew was Jack the Ripper, right?
Sure.
That's their, go-to when it comes to stalkers. And it's like, if you're not, dicing up prostitutes on a daily basis, you're not so bad. It's like, well, wait a minute now.
And that could be why I prefer this version over other versions of Phantom, because I don't think that the Phantom is a character to aspire to. I think that this movie rightfully shows him for the monster that he is. It's amazing that that's what we got. Again, we've covered all the sort of different ways this movie could have turned out. It's amazing to me that it became what it is, this 1929 version, which it's not the original, but I consider it the definitive version. It's just an incredible work of art and holds up by today's standards, which you don't see too often. And we're not going to be able to say the same thing about all these movies that we talk about, but I'm happy to be able to say that about this movie, considering it's the first and it's the earliest, and had so many reasons to not be the case.
Yeah. And, this is one I didn't, this is something I mentioned when we talked about Frankenstein a little bit in the intro episode we did, but like, this is a human monster, okay? Like, this guy isn't like, he doesn't have wings, like any of that kind of shit. Like, it's just pure, what is it? Like, it's just pure, like, human influence, basically,
right.
Like, this is the kind of guy who's like, what they like cult leaders become, where he lures these women into their basement, locks them up, and it's like the Incredible Kimmy Schmidt or whatever. Like that's poor Christine in this scenario. So I think Universal might have realized that like earlier than I thought. Like here right out of the gate, like the Phantom of the Opera is the monster. He's a human being. He's an actual man. We'll get that later with Victor Frankenstein. We'll get that later with the Invisible Man and such. And so like I like that. I never really recognized this before. So this is something I'm paying much more attention to this time around. And here it is right in the first movie. It's really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that this is the first thing we're talking about. And I love that it holds up so well.
The only thing that I kind of miss, one thing
yeah.
from the 1925 version, the 29 version, it's a hard cut out. We're done as soon as the Phantom's dead. And for the most part, I like that when it comes to movies, but the 25 version cuts to this shot of the wedding between Christine and Raul.
Right, it's got an epilogue.
It's got a little epilogue, and it just like, I don't know, again, it just reminded me of like the end of episode 2, where it's just like this, like we just had like this huge war, this big tragedy or whatever, and then we're just gonna cut to a wedding in the middle of nowhere and end it on like this note. But it goes to show, I think, the frame of mind that Carl Laemmle in the studio was in later at that point in 29 was like, this is a horror movie, like let's try and cut this back down to its essence. There's less, it's probably got less jokes, they probably cut a lot of that more out, and they cut out more of the romance and shit, right? They cut the wedding out, and so I think it caters more to being, I don't want to say like the complete version, but maybe this is like the version I think that people should watch.
Yeah, the 25 version has about 20 minutes of extra footage, which expands on Raoul and Christine and the Ledoux and all these other characters. But like I said before, I think that it was smart to cut a lot of that out because the real focus of this movie, like the real star of this movie, is the Phantom, right? You could make the argument that those other characters become less interesting, although I think Ledoux becomes more interesting the more mysterious he is. I think Christine and Raoul become less interesting, and so I don't miss the lack of that epilogue in the 1929-1930 versions because they're not the characters I'm most interested in, right? But if in the 1925 version, if we're gonna say that, okay, these are our main characters and the Phantom is just the bad guy, then yeah, okay, let's build these characters up and then give them a send-off at the end of the movie. But yeah, I think the way that this movie has been cut down since and then, added to emphasize the opera, like the focus has really been put on the Phantom. Like, we don't need to know that Christine and Raoul are going to be okay because the Phantom has been vanquished, right? He's been killed and thrown into the river. Story's over. Raoul and Christine will be fine.
Totally, absolutely, I agree. Yeah, and after all, it is the Phantom of the Opera. So as soon as he's dead, the story should be over.
Right, and I do love that he went from being the villain in a story to being the main character of the story.
That's really interesting too. Now that you mentioned that, like, how often is the main character not introduced, or at least not seen on screen for a half hour? Over on a lot of the other podcasts on Cage Club, and like I feel like it comes up a lot when Tobin Addington's on an episode. Maybe because like I remember this from his class, but it's like, the more you sort of build up a character when he's if you do it well and properly, when he's introduced, he's going to be badass, like, right. Already. Like, you'll already sort of be accustomed to it and ready for him to kick ass or something. And so, like, they talk the Phantom up for like 20 minutes and you see shadows and things like that. But like, yeah, when you first see him in his mask, it's like, damn, here he is. Full blown, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, he's in his next to final form. Like, he's ready to really go. It's really cool.
Yeah, they really laid the groundwork at the beginning of the movie so that Lon Chaney could just show up and just hit the ground running. If nothing else, he's the greatest thing about this movie. I wish there were more Lon Chaney films available. That's the thing about Lon Chaney, is that so many of his films, because this came out towards the end of his career, so a lot of his films have been lost or they're difficult to find. They're just, it's this and Hunchback and there are others that he's in and that you can get, and there are some where he's not even in makeup. He was not unsurprisingly not much of a leading man. He often didn't get the girl, but there were movies where he didn't wear makeup at all, and they do exist. So now I kind of want to seek them out because I really don't know as much about Lon Chaney as I would love to. I really just know him from this and a little bit of Hunchback. So
yeah, check out that Cagney movie if you've got some time. I mean, if you're just to absorb everything about the guy, like, it's totally worth seeing.
Yeah, and I would love to at some point maybe do that as a bonus episode here because I think it would definitely fit in.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think, along the way, how many movies about the movies we're going to be talking about there sort of are. And maybe not directly, but like, there's that movie, I know we're doing Dracula next, not Nosferatu, but there's like, the movie about the making of that movie. It's fictionalized, but then there's like Gods and Monsters about James Whale's career and stuff. And it's funny how many movies about the monster movies, like the making of the monster movies, that there are out there. It's sort of like a whole sort of subsection.
Yeah, and at some point, if we can find the time to squeeze those in, I would love to do that. Please write to us and let us know if you would like us to cover some of those movies, because I think I definitely have the interest to do it. I think with that, we can wrap up this episode, unless there's anything else you'd like to add, Mike.
Oh, there was one thing I meant to mention, like, way earlier. It's just a little tidbit, but like, Raoul's my main man in this movie. I just can't help it. And when he's introduced, he's got like a number 2 on his uniform, and he's second fiddle in the movie. So I thought that was funny. Like, it's like branded on this guy. Like, he's got to get it off him. Like, he needs to win out over the Phantom, with Christine's love and shit. Like, I don't know why I gravitated to that so much about this time, but I just found it so funny and engaging. I was like, this man is not going down without a fight. Like, you are not going to push this guy to the side. He's not sitting in a corner. It's very funny.
Again, I think the idea of Raoul is great. I think I didn't see the same Raoul you did, but I think that there's potential for like all of that. I think we get pieces of that in other Phantom adaptations, and so it's definitely there. You're definitely reading into it correctly, but I don't know that the Raul in this adaptation of Phantom is that Raul. But
Yeah, no, I'm definitely conflating him because of I'm just amazed how much of this feels modern on its own that I think I'm like projecting onto some of these characters when they're not giving me enough just because that's the way movies were made back then. You could only tell so much on a title card. People don't want to, even today people don't want to read subtitles as far as like I'm told. I have no problem doing that. But like could you imagine like going back and being like we got to read this shit too? Like I'm just here to watch and stuff. So I think there's limitations again to just filmmaking at the time and stuff. So they do the best job I think that they could have.
yeah, I agree, and I think we pretty much covered everything that I wanted to get to. I mean, I had some ridiculous notes that I don't think need to be read out loud. I just want to talk about the disc a little bit more for anybody who might be interested in picking it up. Did you have a favorite version of this film overall?
I think my favorite one is just the 1929 one at 20 frames per second. I think that is just, that's probably the one to watch. Is that and the other two, all of the ones from 1929 are pretty much the same. They're just at different speeds with different soundtracks. So it's kind of like, what do you like? Do you like organ pipe music? Do you like orchestra? Or do you want to actually hear the track with the opera on it? And that's the one I would watch again, is probably that one. I loved a lot about the 25 version, but it is very poor quality in comparison to what they do with the others as they're presented. So I think that's the one to watch is the 1929 20 frames per second with that orchestra music. And then check out the audio commentary because that guy knows his shit, man. A really great audio commentary.
Yes, so I agree. I think the 20 frame per second version of this with the Gabriel Thibodeau score is my favorite overall, although the other scores are pretty excellent as well. I think I really enjoyed what he did. Like the most authentic is probably the Gaylord Carter score. That's the pipe organ. So I think when the film premiered originally in 25, they had, Universal spared no expense. They had a real live organist playing there live, and so I think that would maybe the most authentic viewing experience. But I thought that the Gabriel Thibodeau score in the 20 frame per second version was the most enjoyable overall. I particularly enjoyed some of the Mickey Mousing he did with, like, for example, the cat coming down the stairs. You get that sort of like musical sound effect of the cat coming down the stairs. So he does a lot of that and sort of gives you the illusion of sound where there is none. And I thought that was a lot of fun to listen to.
And I primarily like it because, like I said, we get the opera singing. Like you hear human voices on that audio track, which is pretty great.
And aside from that, I think that the 20 frame per second is only really noticeable during a lot of the opera sequences. I noticed it most when the ballet dancers were doing their thing. I could tell that it was a little more choppy, but aside from that, I really didn't notice a huge difference in quality in terms of projection speed. So yeah, definitely get this disc if you don't have it, and check out that 20 frame per second version of the 29 cut.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think this is the only film not in that Universal collection that we're going to be watching everything else from.
When I had the idea for this and we started developing it, I realized that Universal has a box set of their 30 monster movies, and it starts with Dracula. And I thought, why didn't it start with Phantom of the Opera? Because, that was kind of the beginning of the Universal monsters. And I don't know specifically what the reason is. I know that Phantom went into public domain, as you said. It went into public domain in 1953. So it could have something to do with that. Kino Lorber managed to get the distribution rights, and they put together a hell of a good disc.
Like you say, it's in public domain. They could put it on, but maybe they just didn't have access to all these extra special features, right? Like that to me feels like the stuff that's licensed, like maybe certain scores or the audio commentary, or you know what I'm saying, or like extra footage and things. Like that's where my mind went as to why. Because you could get a version of this without all this extra stuff. Nosferatu as well, mentioned that earlier, that's in public domain, so like there's hundreds of different versions of that out there, right? Like I feel like the same for Phantom, so it is curious why they didn't put some copy on their collection.
Yeah, but that's okay. It's really the only one that's missing, so I don't have a problem supporting Kino Lorber. They do some pretty fantastic work.
Totally.
And with that, it's once again time for us to slink back down into our crypts for our month-long hibernation. But don't worry, we'll rise again on Friday, November 27th to chat about Todd Browning's 1931 film Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. So I really hope you join us for that. In the meantime, you can follow us on Twitter at MonsterMadePod, on Instagram and Facebook at The Monsters That Made Us. You can email us at themonstersThatMadeUs@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Dan Colón. And Mike, do you want to tell everybody where they can find you?
You could find me and all my previous work cageclub.me, facebook.com/cageclub, or at cageclubpod on Twitter and Instagram. I guess we also have another email. If you want a question for the network, I guess, at large, you could email us at monsters@cageclub.me. We'll get those as well. And that's about it. I had a lot of fun. I think this was a really fun episode. I look forward to next month.
Yeah, me too. So, man, Dracula, I can't wait. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to support our show, you can become a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/themonstersthatmadeus. For all other things Cage Club related, head over to cageclub.me. That's cageclub.me. So before we go, we would like to wish you a safe and happy Halloween, and stay spooky, everybody.